put us in an impossible position. As far as we're concerned, you stopped being our daughter the day you chose that job over this family." My mother sent that as a text while I was standing in the medication room at the end of a 12-hour shift, and I read it 3 times before I understood she meant it. Then the little notification slid down from the top of my screen. My younger sister had reacted to the message. A thumbs up. She'd given a thumbs up to my own mother cutting me out of the family, the way you'd react to somebody confirming a dinner reservation. I remembered the fluorescent hum of that room. I remembered the smell of the hand sanitizer and the click of the narcotics cabinet locking behind me, and I remember thinking, very calmly, the way you think when a patient is coding and everyone else is starting to lose it. Okay, stop the bleeding first. Feel it later. I'm a registered nurse. I work in a cardiac unit here in the city, and for 9 years I've been the person in my family who fixes things. Not the loved one, not the favorite. The fixer. There's a difference, and it took me until I was 33 and standing in that med room to finally understand it in my bones. I didn't text back. I learned a long time ago that arguing with my mother is like arguing with a parking ticket. The decision's already made, you're just generating paperwork. Instead, I sat down on the little rolling stool, opened the banking app on my phone, and started doing the thing I should have done years ago. For 6 years, I had been the administrator on the family's shared accounts. Not because anyone trusted me, they'd never have used that word, but because I was the only one organized enough to keep the lights on without it becoming a whole production. My father didn't like putting his real information into the computer, so when they finally bundled the house, the 2 vehicles, and Dad's prescription coverage into autopay, it all ran through me. My checking account. My credit card on file as backup. My name on the supplemental health plan that covered his heart medication and Mom's specialist visits because his pension drug plan had a cap they'd blown through years ago. I opened the insurance portal first. I want to be honest about something because I've thought about it a lot since. I didn't cancel anything. Canceling triggers a confirmation email, and an email is a warning, and a warning is a chance for them to get ahead of it. What I did was quieter. I went into the payment settings, removed my card as the funding method, left the field blank, and switched the account to paperless. No letter in the mail, no alert. The change just sat there, silent, like a held breath. They wouldn't find out for weeks, not until my father went to the pharmacy to refill the pills that keep his heart from doing the thing that lands people in my unit, and the pharmacist told him his coverage had lapsed for non-payment. I closed the laptop in my locker, and I waited to feel like a monster. I'd been raised to feel like a monster for far less than this, but it didn't come. What came instead was this strange lightness, like setting down a bag I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing the weight. Then I went into my contacts and I blocked my mother. I blocked my father. I blocked my sister. 3 taps. Quietest thing in the world. My charge nurse poked her head in and said we had 2 coming up from Ember, possible STEMI, and I stood up and smoothed my scrubs and clipped my badge back on and said I was ready. And the funny thing is, for the first time in a very long time, I actually was. I didn't sleep much that night, but not for the reason you'd think. I kept waiting to feel guilty, and the guilt kept not arriving, and that absence was louder than any noise. The next morning was a different story. I woke up to my phone lit up like the dashboard of a car that's about to die on the 401. The blocks had stopped the calls, but voicemail still slid through. 14 of them. My mother had also found her way into email, which I hadn't thought to lock down, and there were 9 of those. The first voicemail I played was my father, and his voice had that low, controlled register he uses right before he detonates. He said I was an ungrateful child. He said after everything they'd sacrificed, this was how I repaid them. He said I had until the end of the day to fix the mess I'd made, or he'd be speaking to a lawyer, and that I clearly didn't understand what I'd started. I deleted it before he finished. You have to understand, they talked about everything they'd done for me like it was a long invoice with my name on the bottom, and I'd let them for years. But somewhere along the way, I'd started keeping my own invoice, the one nobody knew about, the running tally of everything I'd actually done that got rewritten or erased or attributed to somebody else. 4 years ago, my father called me at 2 in the morning in a panic. The credit union was about to start foreclosure proceedings on the house his own father had built, the one that had been in the family 3 generations, the one he was constantly reminding me I'd never appreciate because I'd chosen a small life. He'd remortgaged it twice without telling anyone, sunk the money into one of his sure things, and now it was all coming due. He cried on the phone. I had never heard my father cry. I drained my savings and I picked up every overtime shift the hospital would give me, working 4 months of nights and weekends until I had a permanent ache behind my eyes, and I wired them $38,000 to make the arrears go away. Do you know what my mother told the neighbors? That my father had restructured some investments. I was erased from the story before the transfer even cleared. Then there was my sister. When she decided she was going to be a wellness influencer, her words, she needed a ring light and a good camera and a website and a brand consultant, and somehow all of that came to about $15,000 over 2 years, framed as loans, none of them ever repaid. None of them ever mentioned again. But the worst entry in my invoice wasn't a number. When I was 18, they sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done my homework, the same table where I'd later be told I didn't matter, and my father told me I wasn't university material, said I'd embarrass them if I tried and failed, said it would be better for everyone if I went and found myself for a while. And then my mother, smoothing the front of her cardigan, told me what to say to people. Tell them you're taking a year to travel, she said. Tell them you want to see the world. Don't tell them we asked you to leave. We have a name in this town. So I did. I lied for them. I told everyone I was off to find myself while I slept on a friend's pull-out couch in Scarborough and worked 2 jobs and put myself through nursing school 1 course at a time, and I let the whole town believe I was the flighty one, the runaway, the daughter who broke her poor parents' hearts. I protected their reputation with my own. For 9 years, I was their safety net, their bank, and their public relations department all at once, and they never once said thank you because in their version of events, there was nothing to thank me for. I wasn't a daughter. I was a line of credit they'd convinced themselves they were entitled to. And now the account was closed. I was standing in my kitchen the next morning with a coffee going cold when my mother got through on a number I didn't recognize. I picked up out of pure reflex. Her voice was already at full volume. She couldn't get into the family photo cloud, the one I'd also been paying for and administering, the one with every picture from every Christmas and every grandkid's first steps. Gone, she kept saying. Everything's gone. What did you do? And underneath the anger I could hear something I'd never heard from her before, which was fear. Not fear for me. Fear of losing control. Then she said the pharmacy had told her dad's coverage was inactive and she needed me to stop being dramatic and fix it right now. I didn't say anything, I just listened to her realize in real time that the locks had been changed and she didn't have a key anymore, and then I hung up. A few minutes later, my father left a voicemail, and this one wasn't yelling, this one was worse. He was quiet and precise, and he said that if his accounts and his coverage weren't restored by noon, he was going to make a phone call to the College of Nurses. He said he'd tell them I'd been diverting medication. He said he'd tell them I was unstable, that I'd had a breakdown. He said it so easily, so smoothly, that I understood he'd already rehearsed it. He told me I'd lose my license, I'd lose my career, I'd lose the one thing I'd built entirely on my own, with no help from any of them. I sat at my counter and I felt the floor drop out from under me, because that was the thing they could actually take. Not money. The thing I'd bled for. In my line of work, there's a point where you stop negotiating with someone. When a patient goes from agitated to dangerous, you don't reason with them anymore. You call for help. So I picked up the phone, and I didn't call my father back, and I didn't call the police. Not yet. I called the one person in my family who had never once made me feel like a burden. I called my grandmother's lawyer. My grandmother on my mother's side, my mother's own mother, was the only person in 3 generations who had ever looked at me like I was a whole person and not a resource. When I was small, she used to tell me I had a good engine, which was her way of saying I worked hard, and she'd say it like it was the finest compliment a person could earn. She'd been in failing health for a couple of years, and we both knew the direction things were going, but she'd kept her affairs with an old family lawyer downtown, and over the years, she'd quietly made sure I had his number in case. He answered on the second ring, and before I could even start, he said my name in a way that made my stomach drop. He told me my grandmother had passed in her sleep early that morning. I don't remember sitting down, but I was sitting down. The grief came up through me like water filling a basement, fast and from everywhere at once. And for a minute, I couldn't hear anything he was saying. She was gone. The only one who'd ever seen me was gone, and she'd gone the same morning my father was threatening to end my career, and the unfairness of the timing was so total it almost made me laugh. When I could breathe again, he told me the rest. The service would be small and private, per her wishes, but the reading of her will was set for the following morning, 10 o'clock, at her house. My parents and my sister had already been notified and had already, he noted dryly, confirmed they'd be attending. Of course they had. He said one more thing before he hung up. He said, in the careful voice lawyers use when they're telling you something without telling you something, come prepared and let me do the talking. I spent the rest of that day not preparing my grief, but preparing my face. I want to tell you about that because it's the part I'm least proud of and the part I'd do again in a heartbeat. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and I rehearsed being the daughter they thought I was. I let my shoulders round forward. I practiced looking at the floor. I dug out an old gray cardigan, 2 sizes too big, the cuffs gone soft and pilled, and I put it on. And in the mirror, I didn't look like a charge nurse who runs a code without her pulse changing. I looked like a girl who could be talked into anything. I looked breakable. Because here's what 9 years of being the family doormat teaches you. They had a script for me, the weak one, the one who folds. And the fastest way to win against people who think they already know how the scene ends is to give them the scene they're expecting, right up until you don't. My grandmother's house sat on a quiet street up north of the city, an old red brick 2-story with a deep porch and lilacs along the side that she'd planted the year my mother was born. I'd spent the best afternoons of my childhood on that porch. Walking up to it the next morning in that ridiculous cardigan was the closest I came to crying the whole time. Inside, the front room had been arranged for the reading. The lawyer, a thin, dry man somewhere past 70, with half-moon glasses and a banker's box of files, sat at my grandmother's writing desk. My parents were already there, on the good chairs, dressed like they were attending a gala rather than grieving. My mother in a black dress with the tags money look she could never resist. My father with his watch turned outward so you couldn't miss it. My sister was on the love seat scrolling her phone, one foot bouncing, impatient, like she'd been kept waiting for a table. When I came in, my mother's eyes flicked over my cardigan, my slumped shoulders, and something in her face relaxed. There she is, that look said. There's the one we know. Oh, good, you made it, she said. There's tea in the kitchen, dear, if you wouldn't mind. People will want some. I didn't move. I just looked at the floor and said, quietly, that I was all right, thank you, and took the hard chair in the corner, the one nobody wanted, and made myself small in it. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. He didn't offer condolences to my parents, which I noticed, and they didn't. He said my grandmother had left very specific instructions and that he intended to follow them to the letter. He read the estate into the record. I'd had no idea. None of us had, I think. My grandmother had always lived modestly, the same house, the same sensible car, the same wool coat for 15 winters. But she'd come from people who'd owned land north of the city before the suburbs swallowed it, and she'd sold a parcel of it decades ago and never touched the money, just let it sit and grow with a careful advisor who'd grown old right alongside her. The house, free and clear, appraised at $1.1 million, an investment account of just over $2 million, and cash and bonds bringing the total to a little more than $3.7 million. The air in that room changed. I felt it more than heard it. My sister's foot stopped bouncing. My mother's hand found my father's forearm and gripped it. They weren't grieving anymore. They were doing math. The entirety of the estate, the lawyer continued, looking at no one in particular, is bequeathed to my granddaughter. And then he said my name. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It had weight. It pressed on my ears. My father moved first. He said it had to be a mistake. He said his mother-in-law had been confused at the end, not of sound mind, that he'd noticed her slipping for a year. The lawyer didn't even look up from his papers. He said my grandmother had been assessed by her physician and had executed the will in his office with 2 witnesses, fully competent, and that he had the documentation if my father cared to review it. My father did not care to review it. My mother tried a different door. She laughed, that high, brittle laugh she uses when she's frightened and pretending not to be, and she turned to me with her face arranged into pity. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, "you can barely manage your own life. You can't possibly handle something like this. You'll be eaten alive." She gestured at me, the cardigan, the bowed shoulders, the whole performance, as if I were Exhibit A. Look at her. She's not well. She hasn't been well for a long time. And I let my chin tremble. I let my eyes go wet. I gave them exactly the fragile, overwhelmed girl they'd come to collect. But while they performed their concern, I was reading the room the way I read a patient. You learn, in nursing, to see past what people are presenting to what's actually going on underneath. And what was going on underneath my parents was not grief, and it was not even greed exactly. It was panic. My father's expensive watch had a tick instead of a sweep, a knockoff. The fob on my mother's keychain wasn't for the German car she'd parked out front for everyone to see. It was a rental tag. Up close, their whole glittering life was costume jewelry. They weren't rich people insulted by being passed over. They were drowning people who just watched a life raft float to someone else. The cruelty suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. You can only treat someone like a resource if you've decided you're entitled to them. They'd needed me to be weak so badly because they needed me to keep paying. My father set down the next part like a businessman closing a deal. Given my obvious fragility, he said, the responsible thing, the loving thing, would be for him and my mother to be appointed to manage the estate on my behalf. A guardianship. For my own protection. He was sweating at his hairline now, and he kept checking that ticking watch. And later I'd learn why. The credit union wanted a payment that afternoon or they were moving on the house, the real one, his. And he needed access to money he could already taste. The lawyer, very mild, said there was a mechanism for that. If the family genuinely believed I was unfit to administer the estate, they could petition for emergency conservatorship. But to initiate it, each petitioning party would need to sign a sworn declaration to that effect right now to be entered into the record. My father signed before the man finished the sentence. My mother signed. My sister, after a glance at our parents, signed too, rolling her eyes like it was a formality keeping her from her afternoon. And then I sat up straight. I pushed the sleeves of that ugly cardigan up to my elbows and I sat up straight in the hard chair and I watched my mother's face change as she understood, a half-second too late, that something had shifted in the room. The lawyer slid his glasses up his nose and read one final clause from the will. My grandmother, he explained, had anticipated exactly this. The will contained a no-contest provision. Any beneficiary or family member who challenged the sole heir's competence or sought to wrest control of the estate through legal action would, by that very act, permanently forfeit any claim, gift, or consideration under the will and would additionally trigger the buyout clause, becoming personally liable for any debts they'd represented to the estate as the granddaughter's responsibility. There had been a gift in there for them after all, $100,000 set aside for my parents. My father had just signed it away with his own hand. More than that, the loans he'd been quietly planning to fold into estate management, the ones a creditor was already counting on, were now his alone in writing, witnessed. The color left his face in stages. I watched it go. "This is a setup," he said very quietly. "She tricked us." I looked at him then. I looked at him for the first time all morning with my own eyes instead of the borrowed weak ones, and I felt the strangest absence of anything. Not triumph, not even anger anymore. Just a clean, cold quiet, the kind you feel when the bleeding finally stops. "It wasn't a trick," I said. "It was a test, and you walked in and sat down and signed it without reading the room." I let that sit. I learned that from you, actually. You never read the room either. You just assumed everyone in it was working for you. My father stood up. He had 11 minutes, he said. 11 minutes before the credit union closed and the house was gone. And he begged me. My father, who'd told me I wasn't worth a university education, who'd offered to take my license and my career as casually as ordering coffee, stood in his dead mother-in-law's parlor and begged me for money. And I thought about it. I want to be honest. For one full second, I thought about it, because that reflex to fix things for them ran 9 years deep, and you don't shut it off with a single clause in a will. But then I thought about the med room, and the thumbs up my sister gave to my erasure, and the voicemail where my father practiced ending my career in his calm, rehearsed voice. I didn't reach for my checkbook. I took out my phone and I called the non-emergency line, and I told them there was a domestic disturbance at my late grandmother's home and I'd like an officer present while my family was asked to leave the property. Calm, steady, the same voice I used to tell a family their loved one didn't make it. They went quiet then, all three of them. My mother kept opening her mouth and closing it. My sister, for once, had nothing to say and nowhere to look. The officers were kind and very bored and very firm, and my family walked out of that house into the lilac smell of a spring morning with exactly what they'd brought, which was nothing. The credit union took the other house within the month. The leased cars went back, the club memberships, the dinners, the whole inflated performance of a life. It deflated quietly, the way these things do, with phone calls and final notices and no one to blame but the man in the ticking watch. I heard about it secondhand. I didn't go looking. I kept my grandmother's house. I kept her name on me, the way she'd say, good engine, like a blessing. I moved in that summer, slept the first few nights in the front room because I couldn't bring myself to take her bed, and one evening, while I was clearing out the writing desk, I found a photograph wedged in behind the bottom drawer. It was me, maybe 6 years old, on that porch, gap-toothed and squinting into the sun, holding a watering can almost as big as I was. On the back, in her slanting hand, she waters everything she loves. I sat on the floor and I cried for a long time, finally, for her and for the small, hopeful kid in the picture who hadn't known yet that the people who were supposed to love her would spend 20 years teaching her she was only valuable when she was useful. I didn't throw the photo away. I framed it and I put it on the mantle, and most mornings now I have my coffee in front of it before a shift. If you're waiting for the people who taught you weren't enough to suddenly decide you are, please stop waiting. They will take your savings and your years and your name and they will call it love. And the day you finally stop paying, they'll tell the neighbors you were the cruel one. You don't owe a single thing to people who only counted you as an asset. Change the locks. Water what loves you back. And let the rest of it go take care of itself. I used to believe that if I just gave enough, eventually they'd love me the way I loved them. That was the lie I lived inside for 9 years, and it cost me my savings, my 20s, and very nearly my name. What I understand now, sitting in my grandmother's house with her watering can still hanging by the back door, is that nothing in that story happened by accident. Every piece of it followed from something. My father remortgaged a house he couldn't afford because he wanted a life he hadn't earned, and when it came due, he reached for me because I was the one who'd been trained to reach back. My mother taught me to lie about my own worth at 18, and so I grew up believing my value was something I had to keep purchasing. My sister gave a thumbs up to my erasure because she'd watched our parents treat me like a vending machine her whole life and learned the lesson well. Cause and effect the whole way down. They didn't lose everything because the universe punished them. They lost it because a man in a ticking watch signed a document he was too greedy to read, in a room he was too arrogant to study. That was his choice. The bill simply arrived. What saved me wasn't luck, and it wasn't even my grandmother's money. It was 3 things I had to build in myself the hard way, over years, without anyone clapping. The first was a stubborn refusal to become cruel just because I'd been treated cruelly. I deleted my father's payment from the insurance, yes, but I never lied about him, never poisoned the family against him, never became the thing he was. I want you to hold on to your decency even when the people who raised you didn't give you any of theirs, because the day you trade it away, they've won something they can never give back. The second was learning to actually see, to read a room, to notice the rental tag and the knockoff watch, to understand that panic was driving the cruelty long before I understood it with my heart. Pay attention. Most people lose because they refuse to look at what's plainly in front of them. And the third was endurance, the plain dull grind of it. 4 months of night shifts, one nursing course at a time, a pull-out couch in somebody else's apartment. Nobody saw those years. Nobody handed me anything for them. But they're the reason I could sit up straight in that hard chair when it mattered and not flinch. If you take one thing from what happened to me and Edmund and Cordelia and the rest of them, let it be this. Be good even when it isn't returned. Keep your eyes open even when it hurts to look. And keep going through the long, unwitnessed stretch when quitting would be easier, because that's where you're actually being built. The people who told me I was only worth what I could pay were wrong about me. And they're wrong about you too. Water what waters you back. Let the rest go.